Hello everyone, Gashbad here. I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm going to go over my whole process of painting a miniature. I'm going to be doing a Plaguebearer, specifically this Plaguebearer right here. Now I'm putting this intro in the beginning even though I've done it after I've actually already painted the model. Just to give you an idea of the end result if this is something that you'd be interested in. The reason I'm making this video is because I've had a couple of requests recently asking me about how I paint my models, and I've always resisted doing a video like this because I'm not exactly sure I should be recommending it. I'm not sure this is a painting style that I should advocate. It's kind of like that scene in 13th Warrior, The Funeral. This is the old way. You will not see this again. This is the way people painted in the early role-playing game days. Maybe Rogue Trader 40K, maybe 3rd edition and earlier Warhammer Fantasy. The main problem with painting like this is that it's really time consuming. It takes a long time. People have developed much faster methods of painting that produce a very good result. Another issue is that models have gotten a lot more detailed, and I'm going to be using these very thick, very cheap craft paints, and they tend to obscure detail, especially the way that I paint, which is with a lot of highlight layers. Now, for the older models that don't have as much detail, that's not so much of a problem, but you know, these new plastic kits, they can get really detailed really fast. Still, there are some reasons why you might want to paint this way. Number one, it's cheap for cheapskates. If you want to save some money on brushes and paints, this is a way that you can do it. Some of the specific hobby materials are kind of expensive. Second off, it's a little bit different. There are kind of the prescribed YouTube tutorials to show you how to paint, and a lot of people pick those up and they do them, and so a lot of their armies look kind of the same, and they look different than the old Hammer models that used to be on the gaming table, and sometimes it can draw you a bit of attention to paint in the old style if you're willing to put in the time. And lastly, it may be a technique that you use if you're a bit of a control freak. If you don't like the watery, colory, slap chop, washes, glazes, speed paints, that kind of thing, if that's a little bit too loose for you and you want to just have a system that's more like paint by numbers, where you're gonna get a color exactly where you want it, when you put the color down, that's the color the thing is gonna be, and it's gonna stick there and dry there, and you want to go like that, well, you know, this might be a method for you. Anyway, I want to get that all out of the way beforehand. If you're still here, nice to have you along. Let's get to it. We've got our model all undercoated, all black, doesn't look like much right now. And so we're going to start. The painting comes in 3 major stages. We're going to do all the colors exactly the same. The first stage is the base coat, then we're going to do a wash, and then we're going to do 5 layers of highlights. We're going to keep it simple on our brain, but it's going to be a labor-intensive process, but we're not reinventing the wheel every time we do a color. We're going to have a process that we're going to apply to everything that's colored something different. So I'm using Ceramcoat, Delta Ceramcoat craft paints. I like them, they're cheap, and that's, you know, like I said, one of the primary advantages of this kind of painting is that we're just using really cheap paint. This is going to be for the desert base. I'm going to use Territorial Beige. The base coat is going to be pretty dark. We're going to go about as dark as we want to. These craft paints are thick. You are almost always going to want to add a little water. We don't need to worry about a wet palette. The flow of the paints is not that important. Again, control is a little bit of an advantage to this method of painting. Really what we want is we want to put a spot of paint on the model, and that paint is going to stick there. It's going to go right where we put it, it's going to dry, and we're not going to do anything fancy, we're not going to swish it around or anything like that. It's going to be like paint by numbers. We're mostly going to be using 3 different paint brushes, and they're all going to be cheap. These craft paints ruin your paintbrushes, so you know, don't get too attached, don't buy anything too expensive. We're going to have our nicest paintbrush that we're going to use for detail work. We're going to have our previously nicest paintbrush that we have slowly ruined and the tip has started to fray. And that's going to be used for larger areas and for small portions of dry brushing. And then we're going to have just a bad brush. And that's what we're going to use for mixing paints. And the nice thing about this is that you buy a nice fine tipped brush and it eventually turns into the other kinds. So the sand is a really coarse texture and you don't really want to use your nicest brush on that. You can see in the middle part here, the more you use these, it loosens up the glue that connects the little metal parts to the handle, and it eventually falls off, and so I just wrap some blue tape around it. So let's take out our second brush, second best brush, and we're just going to start putting down some of this territorial beige on the model where the sand goes. The goal is we're going to do a complete coverage. We're not going to leave any black, and we're not going to leave any thin spots where you can see the black through. We don't always get that, especially on the sand base. We might have to do a second coat. That's okay. We're also going to do this in a particular order. The things that are set furthest into the model are going to be painted first, especially the things that get dry brushed. So the grass sits on top of the sand, so the sand gets painted first. You can see he's got these little sores inside of him. We're going to paint those before we paint the skin. The claws, everything. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. You want to paint the inner areas first so that if you make a mistake and you get paint where you don't want it, when you go to paint the outer areas, you can just fix it. Because I do not like doing touch-ups. Touch-ups are a pain. I know it probably makes more sense to be faster and looser with how you paint and then go and fix it later. I always feel like fixing stuff is like going backwards. I would rather take my time in the beginning, get it right, and not have to go back. But to each their own. It's not really that important. So yeah, I'm just going to go through this model. I'm going to put down my base color on each of them. I'll check in with you to tell you what I'm using, and then we'll move on from there. We're moving on to our next color. We're going to paint the grass. We're going to paint it green isle. Just as a warning, I like how the Delta Ceramcoat paints come in giant tubes. It takes you a while to get through them, which means that you don't have to paint from the pot. You can waste dabs. You don't have to feel bad about it, but these colors do go out of production. So especially if you're using kind of a weird color, if you pick it up and you know you like it, you might want to think about going and buying a couple tubes of them just so you have them around, especially if you're not just painting one model, but you're painting, you know, you're eventually going to have a unit of 30, 40, 60 models. They do occasionally get hard to find, and I'm a little concerned that they don't seem to be selling this green isle color locally anymore. So either I have to find something similar, which I don't want to do, or just, you know, make do with what I have. And that's not exactly unique to these craft paints. Lots of people have favorite colors from Citadel's ranges that they're not able to get anymore. Yeah, we're just going to do exactly what we did before, painting the next section of colors, the darker base coat. Moving on to our next color, we're going to do our first mixed color. We're going to do the dark red in the sores of this model. And for that, we're using maroon mixed with a little black. Normally I like to avoid using a mixed color for the base color, but sometimes it's what you want. Now I'm very used to the color that I'm going for, but even if you're not, you're just going for a real dark red. You're going to have lots of opportunities to adjust that color later on. So, a very dark red there. We can get out our detail brush for this. And let's see, what do we got? We got a little bit of intestines right here. I'm just going to go through, show you the points. We got a little sore right there. More intestines. Let's see. There's a big chunk of skin missing right there. You get the idea. We're just going through, finding places that should be red, painting them red. Moving on to the next color, we have ivory. So horns, teeth, eyeball, that kind of thing. Ivory is another mixed color, and it's a good example of how when you're making a darker shade for a wash or a base color, it's not necessarily the regular color just with black added. That's not gonna get you what you want most of the time. So for ivory, what I use is a bunch of yellow, bright yellow, if you're curious, mixed with a little spice brown. And we're just gonna get a real murky yellowish brown. Again, this is not for painting something that's white. This is painting a more organic color. So there we go, a lot of yellow, a little brown. One thing about the way that I paint, I'm gonna paint the eye right now. A lot of people either skip it or do it at the very end, but again, we're painting everything exactly the same way. Now, the eye is hard to paint because it is very small and surrounded by stuff of a different color. But we don't have to worry about that because we can be a little sloppy. We haven't painted the green skin around the eye yet. So when we go to do that, we can fix up all the little mistakes that we made around the edge. Same with the teeth and everything, and that's why we're painting this all now. While I'm here, while I have you, just want to point out this guy's spine. For some reason, these Plaguebearers, when they contacted Nurgle's rot and started turning into Plaguebearers, their spine, for whatever reason, lengthens and pops out of their back. Are they trying to grow a skinless tail or something? How do they hold their bodies up? I'm not exactly sure what's going on with their anatomy, but they've got some problems. Anyway, going through, finding all the nails, claws, that sort of thing, including anything. I don't know this guy. Oh, he's got little horns. There's a little nurgling. Oops, you can't see that. There's a little nurgling stuck to his leg. Well, hopefully you'll see it better when we get it painted. And now for the primary color, we're going to do the Plaguebearer's skin. In this case, I'm going to go with English Yew Green. So again, I'm just using this cheap plastic palette that I bought at a craft store for like $1. If your paint starts to dry out, and depending on how hot it is, how bright the light you're using is, it will eventually do that. Just add more water. Just keep on going. So I'm just going through all the skin areas and putting down a nice even coat. And of course, we had those bits where we didn't get the eye exactly right, and so it's a lot easier. I thin this down a little bit too much to go over and paint those over now. So the green is done. I know that I'm stitching together this video from little clips, and so it looks like it's going really fast, but that did actually take a while to get all that color down, especially since I initially had the paint a little thinner than I like. But we're done with that. The model's almost base coated. We just need the bits of the sword. I'm going to make a bronze, and I'm going to make a silver, the silver for the blade, the bronze for the handle and the pommel. For the blade, I'm going to use Deco Art Shimmering Silver and mix with a lot of black. So Ceramcoat directly doesn't have a lot of choices as far as metallic paint goes. I use metallic paints, there's nothing wrong with it. So I went with the Deco Art. It's fine. I haven't had much problem with most of the metallic paints. I will just briefly mention this. After you have painted with a metallic paint, get a new glass of water. Just empty that out, rinse that out, because if you go on to a non-metallic color, there is a tendency to get little bits of the metallic stuff mixed into the new paint that you're doing from the water. And little bits of metal float around in there, and they'll get on your brush and they'll get on a non-metallic color, which you don't want. I don't have to worry about that, because as soon as the silver color is on the blade, which it pretty much is, I'm going to go directly to bronze. I'm going to use this Deco Art Worn Penny mixed again with a bunch of black. I don't really need to show that. I think you get it by this time. So yeah, I'll see you when we get on to the washes. I lied. Here's me painting a little of the dark bronze color just for completeness' sake. Alright, the first stage is done. Base colors are set, and really this could be our model. We could be done. It's a little dark, but those early White Dwarfs, the early editions of Rogue Trader, Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition, I think a lot of the models in those armies are essentially done to this standard. But we're going to go a little bit further. I mean, most of them obviously went further as well, so might as well. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do our washes. The first thing that I'm going to wash is going to be this desert base. Now, I'll do a wash, and I'll let it dry for half an hour, and then I'll do the next wash. It's possible that if two areas of color don't touch, then you can do the washes at the same time. What you don't want is the washes mixing together, because that's not going to be good for the overall effect. But in this model, none of the colors, none of the separate washes that I'm going to be doing are separate. So I'm going to do a wash, wait half an hour, do the next wash. Oops. And so first wash, desert base. We're gonna take a little spice brown, a darker color of brown than we used for the base color. And there's nothing complicated about it. We're gonna take a little bit of this color and a lot of water. Just gonna mix it together with our bad paintbrush. Just thin it so that it runs around. Yeah, you can kind of see what that looks like there. Take out our second best brush and put it on the area of color that we were talking about. Let's add a little bit more pigment. That's okay. I'm going to do a number of washes. I'm going to mix the green isle with a little dark blue, a little midnight blue for that wash. I'm going to wash the ivory color with a separate brown color. I'm going to use burnt umber in that case. And then everything else is going to get a black wash. The first thing you might ask is, why am I using two separate dark brown colors for two different things? And yeah, you're right. I could have just used a burnt umber for both the base and the ivory, but this is the system that I have, and I like everything being consistent. I did eventually invest in this, just a little notebook where I write down what the color system that I use is. Then I don't have to remember it. If I come back after a long gap and I want to make my model look the same, I can just look in that notebook. I went for years and years without having that notebook, and I'd have to rely on my memory, and it was a giant pain. I really like having the color system that I use written down so I can reference it if I need to. And the trick, of course, is once I try a new color, I really need to write it down there. Even if it's not successful, I'll know what not to do in the future, and if it is successful, well, if I don't write it down right away, I'd have a tendency to forget. So here is the Green Isle plus Midnight Blue, which is a wash for the grass. Now the Burnt Umber wash to the ivory parts. So we got ourselves some new water and we're ready for our last wash. We're going to wash with black. All the areas that are silver, brass, the flesh-colored green, red, they all get this treatment. Normally I would not wash green with black. I would wash it with either a darker shade or the base color mixed with a dark blue, but I want this guy to look a little bit more unhealthy, a little bit more unnatural, so I'm going with the black wash. Given how many highlight coats we're gonna do on this model, you might ask why bother with these washes at all. It's grand scheme of things, they don't add that much to the tonal shifts in what we're doing, but I do like the washes. First off, if you just want to stop after the washes, that's fine. It adds a little bit more depth to the model, and it looks a little bit better in my opinion than just the base colors. You do get some shading in the recesses that you wouldn't normally get, so it does add something. And I also like the washes because it kind of softens the little areas of black that you might have left from the undercoat between the colors. It just helps blend those spots where one color meets another a little better. So while it's not strictly necessary, you're not really investing a whole lot of effort in putting a wash down, and I think it does help a bit. So we're gonna finish this up and then we'll go on to the big one with the highlights. Okay, we're through the first two stages of our miniature painting. This is what our model looks like right now. Now we're on to the highlights, and again we're starting with the dry brushing colors. For dry brushing, I'm going to be doing the desert base, the green grass, and the silver of the sword. So since the lowest part is the desert base, we're going to start with that. And my formula, of course, you can use whatever formula you like for these. This is just the stuff that I have found. Don't feel compelled to follow along with what I've got. You're going to have to improvise at some point, so, you know. I'm going to start with trail tan. The next highlight is going to be trail tan mixed with sandstone. The next highlight is going to be sandstone, then sandstone mixed with white, and then sandstone mixed with more white. Do you really need to do 5 highlight coats? No, you really do not. You can just make your color changes a little bit more extreme and use fewer and just spend a little bit more time blending or being careful with how you transition from one color to the other. And especially for dry brushing, you really don't need this many highlights. Dry brush tends to blend on its own. It's one of the advantages of the technique. So I could go a lot brighter, a lot faster. I could knock it down to maybe 2 or 3 highlight coats and be just fine. But I'm a creature of habit. I like to do 5 highlight coats for everything, and so that's what I'm going to do. And of course, dry brushing is you just take your paint with your color on it, you wipe off most of it, and then you lightly brush it along the surface that you are painting. And so just the raised areas are going to collect the paint, and that's really what miniature painting is about. You're making a transition from a dark color to a light color. The light color is generally the raised area where the most light naturally reflects from. So dry brushing is a good technique to do that very quickly. For this first highlight coat, I'm really going to put a lot of paint down. So I'm not brushing a lot of it onto the paper, the newspaper that I have sitting on my mat here that you may have noticed. You may have wondered why all the little spots of paint on it. Well, it's from all the colors that I dry brushed. So this is really kind of more of an overbrushing technique for this first stage. But as we go through, we're going to brush more of the color off onto the paper and restrict ourselves to just the very tops of this coarse sand that we've got on the base. And you know, the area, sorry if you can't see that, the areas that would naturally fall in shadow, like right in the middle here where the Plaguebearer's shadow would fall, we're going to give it a dry brush with this first color, but then we're going to get less and less interested in putting highlights down in that area as we go on. So, down a lot of color here, and as we go on, we might just skip that area entirely. And again, if I get a little paint on the green areas, well, that's why we're doing this first. As promised, we've now mixed up an intermediate tone with trail tan mixed with sandstone. I'm going to take our model there and just brush on the next level of highlight. Obviously, dry brushing ruins brushes very quickly. Do not use the brush with the nice tip on it. Use your second best brush if it's a small area, and use your worst brush if it's a large area. Highlight of just sandstone. Highlight of sandstone plus white. We're now taking most of the paint off of the brush. We're wiping most of it away. We're no longer dry brushing underneath the Plaguebearer, and we're just lightly running it along the sand to just get the very top details of this surface. And now the very final highlight of sandstone mixed with quite a bit of white. We're just going to get the very tops of some of the larger grains of sand. And you can see the contrast has already built up quite a bit. That ground now really pops in comparison to the rest of the model, which has not been highlighted. But that's okay. We're going to take care of that real soon. Moving on to the grass color, we are going to do much the same thing we did before. We're going to start with green isle mixed with leaf green. Then we're going to add a little bit more leaf green. Then we're going to go straight to leaf green. And then finally we are going to mix leaf green with a little apple green. And the final highlight will be leaf green mixed with even more apple green. A little more leaf green added to the green isle. Yeah, sand painted to look like grass. This will absolutely mark you out as an Oldhammer player. Now straight leaf green plus apple green. Finally, the barest brushing of leaf green mixed with even more apple green. For our final dry brush color, we're going to be doing the silver, which is of course shimmering silver mixed with black, and then as we go through the dry brush layers, we add more and more shimmering silver to the mix. Silver's a little unusual. First of all, normally when I'm painting metallic surface, I won't dry brush it. I mean, unless it's really textured, like chainmail or something like that. Really, that dry brush is perfect for doing chainmail. But for swords, normally I do a typical layering thing, which we're going to get to in a little bit. I don't normally dry brush them. But for this guy's sword, I want it to look kind of pitted and corroded and like it's not very good condition. And so I'm going to do a rougher dry brush, which is going to be less smooth, less shiny. It'll fit what I want this to look like. Also, for my silver, I'm going to keep it kind of dark, and I actually do this for most of my silver. This is one of the few cases where I don't do 5 highlight layers. I will only do 4. Part of that is because the silver paint that I use, it's really not that bright, so it's not really worth going up any further because it only goes so far. And like I said, I don't want this to be a gleaming, nice looking sword. I want it to look kind of aged and gross, and so I'm just not going to be highlighting it up as much as I could. So only 4 dry brush layers for this one, which is still kind of a lot, but it's not going to take us a long time. I'm not going to narrate when I switch colors. You guys get it by this point. I'm just going to do a little cut, show you the next level, and go from there. So now we're moving on to the non-dry brush colors, and the innermost color that we're working with for this model is going to be the red, the dark red. And so you remember our base color was maroon mixed with a bunch of black. Well, our first highlight is going to be maroon mixed with not so much black. So it's going to be an intermediate tone, not between maroon and black. So I'm just gonna mix up a bunch right on top of our old base color. You may have noticed that I've kept my mixed base colors in the paint tray. And that's helpful because when I want to go and mix up the next highlight coat, I'll have a point of reference so I don't go too dark or too light. So I'm just gonna mix it up to a stage just a bit lighter than what we started with. Something like that. And like I said, the idea behind miniature painting is that you're moving from a dark color to a light color on your model in a way that looks believable, a way that makes it look like something that exists in the real world. I mean, it does, but the more contrast you get, the more convincing the model is going to be. And so what you're going to do is you're going to paint these lighter colors on spots that would naturally be lighter. So that would be the top surfaces, the protruding surfaces, the higher edges of things, so places like the undersides, folds, that kind of thing. You're going to leave those be because those will remain dark. And of course the nice thing is that the protruding areas are easier to paint. So it makes it kind of nice. That's why dry brushing works. You just run your brush along the surface and you get the highest areas, which would naturally reflect the most light. That would be the lightest color. Layering, the way that we're doing it, is working a lot the same way. The benefit of using these cheap, thick paints is that as you go through, they'll actually build up layers of paint. So the protruding surfaces, as you go on, will protrude even more and will be easier to pick out. So with some painting techniques, you like washes or glazes or things like that, they have other methods of making a dark to light transition look smooth and pretty. So we're not doing anything fancy like that with this. What we're doing instead is achieving a smooth transition by volume. We are doing several successive lighter layers we don't have to be as precise about blending one layer with the other because there's going to be a bunch of layers. This next lightest layer, we don't have to do anything fancy when putting it on top of our base color layer because it's not that different tonally. So the shift from one color to the other is not going to be that great. And then we're going to pile on even more layers of color so the transition will even be harder to detect, will even be smaller. So the goal is you're going to get a smooth transition of colors, not through any fancy swishing around or blending or using watered down paint to actually transition. We're just doing a successive number of increasingly lighter colors. And so now we're going to continue on with the next highlight. We're going to do 5 highlights like we always do. Why? Because what are we going to do? 6 highlights? We got other things to do today. And 4 highlights? That's not old hammer. You do 4 highlights, you might as well just do 2 thin coats. And that's not what we're doing. No, I'm just kidding. Do how many as you like. Anyway, our next highlight is going to be maroon, Tompe red mixed with a bright orange, in this case pumpkin, and then Tompe red mixed with a little bit more pumpkin. The next color is ivory, so again I'm just mixing bright yellow with spice brown, this time with a little bit more yellow and a little less brown. And then for the next highlights I'll just be adding small amounts of ivory to the mix to lighten it up. Here we are on the very top highlight of ivory, so this is the yellow and brown mixed with the most amount of ivory that I'm going to add. And just to point this out, yeah, I've been highlighting as I have problems. So I'm just going to add the final drop of the lightest color in the center there. And then while we're thinking about it, might as well rinse that out. Get a little bit of black on the brush and add in the pupil. Yeah, so we've got 5 of our 7 colors highlighted, so you'd think that we'd be about done with this guy, but we still haven't done the skin color, which is going to be where most of our time is spent. Hey, by the way, if you're wondering why I'm holding him by different things as I paint him, you know, I don't have a little thing attached to the base and holding it by that. These paints are pretty thick. They stick pretty well. We've done our undercoat. It's pretty uncommon that you're going to rub off any of the paint while you're working on it. Just be a little gentle with it. Watch out for parts that really stick out, like the sword, like horns, spines, that kind of thing. As long as you're not touching those too often, you should be fine. Occasionally you will get a time when you'll wear off one of these little pokey spots and even get a little bit of oil or grease on there. It'll be real hard to paint over it, but that's pretty uncommon, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to be gentle with them and do like this. Anyway, the skin color. So, like I said, our base color was this English yew green. We're going to highlight with a bit of this lighter pale cactus green. Again, go ahead and use whatever you like. I haven't added too much of the cactus green because we did wash the model in black, and so it's pretty dark right now. So you could just about highlight it with straight English yew green and be fine. And let me see. So then we're just going to go over and we're going to start putting down the first highlight on this model. And as I said before, we're going to concentrate on the top. So you see lower down, I'm leaving the folds of the skin the darker color, but at the top I'm pretty much just painting all over it because it's going to be a lot lighter. You're going to paint around 75–80% of the model this lighter color. You're not going to leave a lot of the original base color and wash showing, but you do want a bit. So you want to avoid, say, the undersides of the arms, the undersides of the legs, you know, underneath his chin. You know, if there's a real sharp angle under those areas, you could, you know, give it a little edge highlight somewhere, but otherwise you're just going to ignore them. You're going to stick to the top areas and just go over pretty heavily all the parts that stick up or stick out. See, this is tucked fairly down into the model, but I'm still going to paint it because this is just our first highlight. We're going to get a lot lighter after this. And as you can see, the thing with this is that there's a lot of folds, a lot of creases, which, you know, even though they're not necessarily details per se, they are treated as such. And are things that we want to be careful with. And so this is going to take us a while. So we've finished our first highlight coat on the skin color, and we've added a bit more cactus green. That's all these highlight coats are going to be. I'm just going to be adding in increasing amounts of cactus green and then applying it to smaller and smaller areas, going further up the model on more extreme levels of the parts that stick out. The only real exception to this is that I'm mostly painting over the boils. I have something a little special in mind for them. I'm going to make them a little brighter than the rest of the model. I'll explain that in more detail when I get to that stage. But otherwise, it's just gonna be me doing exactly what I've been doing this whole time, going over these pieces and just lightly dabbing on a little bit of lighter color on the raised areas towards the top of the model. So here's the model after 5 highlight coats on the skin, and you can see it's looking pretty good. All we really have left are a couple of details to sort out, and this guy's going to be done while we have the last highlight color mixed and ready still. I'm gonna bring up those boils like I said I was going to do. Sometimes you want to go in and just add a little extra highlight to some areas that are really important. a face, a weapon, something like that. And in this case, I want to emphasize those boils because, of course, this is the Boils Battalion. So I've gone and I've mixed a little bright yellow into the green, and I'm going to go through and I'm gonna just bring up a couple extra highlights on these blisters that he's got, just to emphasize them, make them look extra gross, and just add to the whole feeling of the model. And this is going to be real quick. That's looking pretty unpleasant. We're going to do it one more time. I've added in a little extra bright yellow to the mix. We're going to do one final tip-top spot highlight on the very centers of these blisters. And that'll be this Plaguebearer skin done. It feels like we're done, but we do still have one more color, that brass color on the hilt and pommel. So, 5 highlights. We're going to start off with worn penny mixed with black, then we're going to add in a little more worn penny, then straight worn penny, then worn penny mixed with deco art bronze, and then straight bronze. Here's the stage in this model that is one of my least favorite things about miniature painting. I've got the whole model painted up. All my colors are highlighted up as far as I want to get them. But there's just this extra little thing you have to do at the end. Sometimes it's a tattoo or war paint or an insignia or something. I hate going over my nicely painted stuff that I spent so much time on and adding in an extra thing, but you know, sometimes it's what you gotta do. So in this case, I want to add a little rust effect to the blade. It's not grimy and gross enough. So my rust formula is I'm going to take a little of this brown iron oxide. I'm going to mix up a quick wash. Just need a little bit of it. Don't even need to change the paint water. I don't care if any metal flakes get in this because, again, I'm just painting over metal. So it's fine. Take out my second best brush and just spread a little of this along the blade. Get it nice and gross looking. Put it into the recesses, leave the extreme edges as they are, and it can be fairly thick. And then I'm going to let that dry before I go on to the next stage of this rust. Once the wash is dried, we're going to go in with a pair of colors. We're going to do this a lot like dry brushing, but it's not dry brushing. It's not dry brushing. We're stippling is what we're doing. So we're going to go in with Adobe Red and then Pumpkin. And we're just going to start with the Adobe. And we're just going to get a bunch of the color off the brush because we're not really putting down a solid layer of color. We're just coming in and spotting some of that color into the spots on the blade that we want it to look rusty-ish. So just avoid the edges, really, more towards the base of the hilt, into these cracks. And again, you can be pretty generous with it. Subtlety in miniature painting is a bit overrated sometimes. Then once you're happy with the amount of Adobe that you've got down, you go on to the pumpkin. I know this looks really bright, but if you want it to stand out, you kind of have to use some brighter colors, otherwise it just sort of gets lost. Now, just on the last few things here, we're gonna paint the edge of the base black. So you see I got a little crazy with the dry brushes along there. I'm just gonna go along, reestablish that black line, paint that all in black. Some people like to have the sides of their bases be brown or green or whatever. That's fine. I personally like the sides to be black. I think you're not really trying to make these look like anything. They're not supposed to look like grass or earth or anything. They're an abstract element of the miniature. So might as well, you know, have them painted something different. And I just kind of like the way that the black frames out the model. So I'm going to go over the sides. I'm going to be careful to get that line in nice and straight. I'm going to do the underside as well, just that edge. And then I'm going to set that on this little, that's the end of the cap from an old tube of crazy glue. I'm going to let that dry because I don't want my varnish to reactivate it. So I'm going to finish that up, let it dry, be back in a minute. Last step, and I swear we're done. Our model is all painted, all finished. I wish I didn't have to use this next step, but unfortunately this is a gaming piece. It is meant to be used on the tabletop, so really gotta protect it. The problem is that every varnish that I use modifies how the paint looks, and often it makes it look duller. It fades out the colors, makes the contrast less interesting. Some of these gradations that we've got, you tend to lose it. I don't have a great solution for it. If you found something that doesn't change the way the paint looks and still protects it, hey, let me know. I don't trust spray varnishes. They also change the way the color looks. So that's not really a solution that I'm looking towards anyway, and I've had some experiences early on where it just didn't seem to really protect the model. I still ended up with chips and flecks and that kind of thing, so I only use brush-on varnishes. The thing you want to watch out for is that even matte varnish tends to leave a real shiny coat, and it actually fades away after a while. So if you use your models for years on end like I do, it'll eventually look fine. But recently I've been using this dull coat top coat from Testors, and it is not shiny and seems to work pretty well. So that's what I've been doing. So new water, no paint in it. I also have a special old brush. This is a brush that I never use for paint. I only use for varnish. I don't want any bits of paint getting in there. We're gonna open that up. Take out a little, just a little. You don't want to use a whole lot of it on any given area, because if it's too thick, it does tend to cloud up. And again, I want to do this quickly and efficiently, because the more I mess around with it, the more likelihood I think there is of me reactivating the acrylic paint and spreading it around and ruining some of our details. So I'm just working fast and as finely, using as little of this stuff as I can to completely coat the thing. So I'm going to get all the parts of the model, including the base, and that'll be it. You've made it. You've gone through the whole process I use to paint a miniature. Congratulations. And so you can maybe see at this stage why it takes me so long to get to other projects. You know, I'll have just a couple of models left to do, and it'll take me months to get them done and go on to the next stage of Warhammer Quest or whatever it is that I'm working on. Anyway, leave a comment below if you have any questions, observations, or concerns, and I will see you on the next one.